That totally works. Good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and we'll get started here this morning. If you didn't get a bookmark when you came in, raise your hand. We've got a couple gentlemen that'll pass these out to you. Some over here, fellas, in the middle here. This is just to give you a list, a reminder of what we're going to cover this summer. This is a team-taught class. Yep, take those. Between myself, Kent, and Lee, and we're going to be jumping around quite a bit, so we thought it'd have a good idea to have, actually Steve's idea, to have a physical reminder of where we're going to be going this summer in our summer class. I want to start off by thanking Robert. I saw him this morning, really enjoyed the 2 Corinthians study that we've been going through the last couple months. There we are. Love the way that and really respect the way that you dive deep into the scripture and appreciated the opportunity to look at that book in detail. This class is going to be moving around a lot. As you can see on the slide here, we're going to be covering quite a bit of territory. I've really enjoyed studying for this. I know Kent and Lee have as well, digging deep into this topic. You'll notice the graphic we picked here has got the roots there on it, this idea of deeply rooted, the elders picking this topic. Sort of the foundation of the gospel is what we'll see that emerges out of these lessons. And the idea that God presented the gospel and how Jesus is going to come into the world, even in the book of Genesis. And so this topic was set up initially by Bruce maybe 3-ish weeks ago. He had a lesson on this from the pulpit. And then Ryan Goodwin, I don't know if he was prepped for that or Tim says no, inspired perhaps. He spoke 2 weeks ago about Jesus being the hub. He had that figure with the Jesus in the center of the wheel, the spokes coming into that. And I really loved his quote. Wrote it down here. Ryan said that the Bible is Jesus from cover to cover. And that's what we're going to start seeing this morning. We're going to start in the first part of the cover. If you want to open up to Genesis 3, we'll start there in just a few minutes. And then at the end of the class, we'll link it to the very end, into Revelations. So this idea of Jesus being in the Bible from cover to cover. Okay, so this morning what we're going to try to get through, and what we will get through, is Genesis chapter 12, 22, and 28. And then if we have a couple minutes left at the end, we'll look at quickly at Genesis 49, that blessing that Jacob gave to Judah. Just as a kind of a foundational slide here, the idea of the Hebrew term Mashiach, and I had to listen to that like 20 times to finally get that down. Mashiach is how it's pronounced, is in the Bible, refers to, it is the Messiah, and it refers to one who's anointed. This could be a prophet that's anointed, a priest that's anointed, or a king that's anointed. And if you think about this term and you think about perhaps how many times it has been used in the Bible, any guesses? How many times is Mashiach used? 4 times, 40 times, 400? Anybody venture a guess? I see some 400s. Yeah, I see some thumbs up for 400. Turns out it's about 40. About 40 times. 39 is what it's thought. 39 times in the Bible, most writers say, depending on the textual context of how you look at that. And we're going to look at a lot of these through our summer series here, these 39 different. I would have guessed 400 too. I thought when I first started reading into this that it would have been higher. We'll look at a few examples of prefigured messiahs in the Old Testament. We'll look at Moses a little bit and David. And this idea of God rolling out what the Messiah would look like from passages in the Old Testament. So another little trivia question here. When's the first time that Messiah is used in the Bible? I was wrong on this one too. When I would have said probably Genesis. We're starting in Genesis, right? If we're going to start about Messianic prophecies, and we're starting in Genesis, then I would have assumed Messiah is used in the book of Genesis. It's not true. Genesis, Job, Exodus, sort of these early written books, the word Messiah is not used at all. We're going to talk about today the Genesis chapter 3, 12, and 49, and these messianic expectations, sort of these messianic previews are talked about, but the word itself is not used. In Job as well, there's a messianic hint, but not the word Messiah. The word actually is first used by Hannah in her prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 2. We'll study that in about a month or so. We'll look at this passage in 1 Samuel 2. And then it's used a lot to talk about David, of course, the anointed one of Israel, who's a prototype for the Messiah. And then Psalms 2 really starts to ramp up the use of this term Messiah. Kent and Lee will talk about the major and minor prophets, Isaiah, Micah, a lot of use of the term Messiah. It's now in these passages clearly portrayed as a divine figure and a kingly figure in these passages. And then the later prophets also have the term in there repeatedly. And these later prophets, then what we see is this final Old Testament development of the term Messiah before the New Testament fulfillment of Christ there. So then sort of to look at where we are headed this morning, what we're going to see is that this term Messiah, it's gradually sort of introduced in the scriptures. It clearly has its theological roots in Genesis. We'll see that this morning with the promise to Abraham. We have the first use there in Samuel, and then the full fulfillment in the prophets that we'll study later this summer. I think that the punchline for this morning, we'll come back to this at the end of the class, is that the Bible's messianic message is a unified story. It is a story that's progressively revealed. God sort of rolls it out slowly, and it's centered on the anointed Son who brings salvation to the world. And that's what Ryan meant by his comment, the Bible is about Jesus from cover to cover. And I think that is set up beautifully in this class that we're going to have this summer. So when we talk about an anointed one, we can have a prophet, which of course is a voice of God. We can have a priest, which is a mediator, or a king, which is a divine ruler. And we see different messiahs in the Old Testament that have some of these roles, and then we see the Messiah in the New Testament that's going to fulfill and bring together all three of these roles. There's also in the Old Testament, and New Testament writers allude to this idea that there are prefigured messiahs in the Old Testament. We see Jesus is referred to as the last Adam in 1 Corinthians as well as in Romans. Adam functioned as a prophet, priest, and the ruler of the garden before sin, and had that prefigured Messiah role. We also see Melchizedek. We've had a couple mentions of Melchizedek from the pulpit recently. Maybe Robert mentioned it in his class as well. I don't remember if it was from there. But this idea that Melchizedek was the king of Salem. He was a priest of God, and he acted as a prophet with his interactions with Abraham. And then the Hebrew writer, of course, writes about how he's frustrated that he couldn't dig deeper into what Melchizedek's role was because the folks he was writing to didn't have a strong enough base in their understanding. But clearly, he was a prefigured Messiah. We also see Moses as a prefigured Messiah. He's the greatest prophet that Israel ever had. He was a mediator between God and Israel, and he acted as the ruler and judge of the Israelites for the time that he was there. And then probably the most common one that we think about as a prefigured Messiah is David. The term used repeatedly to describe David as the anointed king. He was a prophet in terms of authoring Psalms 110, the messianic focus in that Psalms. He offered sacrifice and was a mediator there in 2 Samuel 6, and of course was anointed ruler of Israel. And then we see the Messiah come from his line, the line of Judah. So embodying all three of these roles then. So these men foreshadowed what we see in Jesus, but of course Jesus is the one that brings all of these together. These offices being then a central theme of the Old Testament, that we see lots of prophets, we see lots of priests and lots of kings, and then Jesus working as the prophet, the priest, the king, really the climax of God's redemptive plan that we'll see rolled out here in Genesis. And that was one of the fun things to really read about a number of different authors' viewpoints on this topic. And this idea that if you flip over to Genesis 3, verse 15 here, this idea that this is the first gospel. This is where we have God's redemptive plan initially sort of foreshadowed, where and the writers refer to this as the proto-evangelium, or the first gospel, where God says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." And so this being that first idea that someone is going to come and crush Satan, and the first time that Christ is alluded to there in the Bible. So we see then the seed of the woman, of course, will be Christ to do that. This is, many writers say that this is the earliest messianic hope that we see. And it's connecting then Christ's victory over sin and death to that initial sinful event that we have in the garden. And I really like what Pritchett wrote in reading what he said. He says, everything else in the Bible flows from these words. Without this event and this statement, our, as Gentiles and the Jewish nation as well, our salvation is murky at best. And so this event here is really where we see the first rollout of that messianic hope. Happy to pause. Questions, comments, thrown quite a bit out there already. Yep, there we go. Speaking of throwing. Yes?
This is one of those passages that because we know the end of the story, we understand it. But without the end of the story, you wouldn't read this passage in Genesis and just on the surface ever get Christ the Messiah and all the playing out of it. So it is we see these things in hindsight because of Galatians 4 and other places where it's referred to by those New Testament writers.
Yeah, without a Christ-centered understanding, you don't see it. And I think have a slide that a little later on that Jesus talking there on the road to Emmaus. He tells them then in that what this was all about, and then their eyes were open to, oh, that's what the Old Testament was talking about. So even New Testament Jews, no connection probably with this passage.
Yeah, the mystery.
Right.
On the mystery multiple times, but they weren't going to get it without the light bulb coming on.
Exactly.
Somebody showing them, here's how it fits together.
Which was divine inspiration and the Holy Spirit leading those folks. Yeah. So, but from our viewpoint, fun to go back and see that. The excitement sort of build from this first event. We then see Genesis, we go through Genesis 4 and 5. We see Cain and Abel, Cain killing Abel. Genesis 6 through 9. Then we have the flood, God's covenant that he'll never destroy the world again with rain. Genesis 10 through 11. We hit then the Tower of Babel, the line of Shem preserved, which then leads to Abram, and he's going to be the central figure that we talk about for sort of the rest of the morning. This idea that there are two divine speeches that God has with Abram, who then becomes Abraham, the first in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. We'll take a look at that one, and then Genesis 22. where God swears an oath. In each of these, though, that term Messiah is not used. We see, as Tim mentioned in hindsight, this foundational Messianic theology that places an emphasis on God's plan through Abraham, but that term isn't used in any of these passages. So let's just start there in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. God talking to, at this time, it's Abram. And he says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go to your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord told him. So in this passage here in 12, we see God's initial call to Abram and a promise. The key elements that he promises to Abram are of course, land, going to make of you a great nation. And then for us, that the key piece is that blessing to all the families. Pretty high-level generic verbiage that God throws out there initially, right? He just says, I'm going to give you a land and a nation and bless families. Just like Tim pointed out, I'm sure Abram had no idea what those three items were exactly. And he's going to get a little more clarification as we move through Genesis regarding what God did mean. But I think, for us, in looking back at it, this passage here really sets the trajectory for that messianic hope that then culminates in Jesus and in him fulfilling that Abrahamic covenant. So that we have that in chapter 12, and then if we jump to chapter 15, this has been a chapter that's always intrigued me. This is one where Abram takes some animals and cuts them in half and lays them out before God. Really, I'd encourage you to take a look at that chapter. It's one that I always find very interesting. And in this chapter, God formalizes his promise with Abram a little bit stronger. He provides some more direct language. He talks about this is going to be a biological son that you have, even though Abram's old already. He talks about the land that he's going to possess. He talks about the possessions that he's going to get. And he even tells Abram that your offspring are going to be under oppression for 400 years. And then they're going to come out of that. So a lot more information is given. And importantly, Abram's faith is credited as righteousness. He listened to God. When God said, go do this, he did it. And that's another link between, I think, our covenant with God and the Abrahamic covenant is that idea of faith and doing provides this redemptive plan that God gives us. So Abraham, his name is changed to Abraham, or the father of a multitude of nations there in chapter 17. The promise is tied to Isaac and not to Ishmael, this idea that it'll go through Isaac. 18 through 21, we have Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is rescued. God protects Hagar and Ishmael there in the desert. And then that brings us to another central theme or time point in Genesis, this idea of Genesis 22, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Again, a very theologically rich and difficult passage to initially wrestle with, this idea of taking your only son, the one that's been promised already as the one that's going to bless all nations, and go sacrifice him. And again, Abraham does what God says. He's tested. He comes through that test. And then God provides the substitute, that ram, for him to sacrifice. So in chapter 22, verses 11 through 18, we read here in Genesis, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here am I.' And the angel says, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.' And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, 'The Lord shall provide.' as it is said to this day, on the mount on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand is on the seashore, and the offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So again, this key sort of climax to that this Abrahamic covenant is told to Abraham here by the angel of the Lord. A couple very intriguing interactions in this passage. One is God swears an oath to Abraham. So we said Messiah is used 39 times in the Bible. How many times do you think God takes an oath in the Bible? Any guesses on that one? You think a bunch? Okay. How many is a bunch? A dozen? 2 dozen? Tim's saying about a dozen. About a dozen? Yeah. So it turns out about 10 to 15 passages, depending on how you interpret them, the textual variation, about 10 to 15, listing them up here. That's kind of small. Genesis 22, we see Exodus, a covenant of faithfulness, land is promised to the patriarchs in Deuteronomy. We'll see some in Psalms and Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then the Hebrew writer talks about the assurance that we have to believers, right? So pretty rare for 10 to 15 times God to take an oath like this and promise this to Abraham. Another really key piece of this passage is here, highlighted in red. We see that the angel of the Lord explicitly says, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. There's a lot written about this by theologians. No offense, Tim, but the word nerds sort of geeking out on is this a singular offspring? Is this plural? How should this be contextualized? And, you can go down a rabbit hole and read about that, or you can just flip over to Galatians chapter 3 and sort of Paul defines it for us. Paul says, now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but instead referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. So Paul removes any mystery here. Yeah, the disciples there on the road to Emmaus with Jesus probably understood this after Jesus talked to them after his death and resurrection. And then Paul removes any doubt here in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 to say, this offspring, it's Jesus. Don't be mistaken about this. God knew this from the very beginning. Pause again there. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, so here in chapter 22, 11 through 18, we see God swearing an oath. He says, by myself I have sworn. He repeats and intensifies the promise. This is the third time, really, that Abraham has seen these promises. Numerous descendants, possessions of enemy gates, and then global blessings through an offspring. And many writers view this as the really important climax in the narrative, the discussion, really, between God and Abraham that we see starting there in chapter 12, again in chapter 16, and now in chapter 22. And this Abrahamic covenant is then also reaffirmed multiple times. We'll take a look in the next slide at Isaac. It's reaffirmed to Isaac. We'll take a look at Jacob in Genesis 28. And then it's also reaffirmed to Joseph in Genesis chapter 50. So the next sort of illustration of God rolling out this promise in Genesis is Genesis chapter 28. This beautiful imagery scene here of Jacob's ladder. This is, if you remember, this is right after Abraham dies. Jacob flees the land because of how he has treated his brother Esau. He's afraid of Esau. He's running, and while he's asleep, he sees this vision that we'll read about here. And in the vision, God is standing at the top of this ladder and speaks directly to him and reaffirms this covenant promise. So in Genesis 28, 10 through 15, we read here, Jacob left Beersheba and went to Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of the Lord were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. So again, we see the same blessing that Abraham, this covenant that he received, Jacob receives here in this passage. And I'll just point out again, he lays it out in the same order in each time that they talk about. They talk about the land that he's going to be given. They talk about the offspring and how it'll be a numerous nation. And then this idea of blessing all of the families of the earth. Again, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, surely no clue what that third piece of this puzzle meant. But for us, looking back, is a foundational element of our belief in the Bible. So this idea of from Genesis to Jesus, we can see God's plan to bless nations begins here in Genesis. There's one that promised offspring in this Abrahamic covenant that's then fulfilled in Christ. We see, importantly, that Abraham had faith and obedience, and this is why he is blessed. And that's a similar trait that we share with Abraham in order to be a part of that covenant, is that faith and that obedience that's expected of us. And then in the New Testament, in the last 5 or 6 minutes here, we'll take a look at a few examples where Jesus, in his mission, directly says, when God was talking to Abraham, he was talking about me. It wasn't somebody else. Jesus is saying those passages back then in the Old Testament, those were foreshadowing what I was going to do. So just a couple of points from other writers outside of Genesis. One, Bruce Waltke, says Genesis 12 really marks a turning point in human history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis is a lot about judgment, men doing wrong and God judging them. And then in Genesis chapter 12, moving forward, the Bible pivots to talking about redemption and how we attain that. Walter Kaiser talking about Genesis 12 as the missionary mandate of the Old Testament. And then the Apostle Paul sees Genesis 12 as a gospel preview. He explicitly says there, as Tim alluded to in Galatians 3:8, Paul writes, the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, us, he preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all nations be blessed. I love that idea that Paul explicitly says the gospel started back in Genesis. When before I dove into this, you asked me when did the gospel message start. I'm going to give you a New Testament passage for that. That's not what Paul says. The gospel started back with Abraham, and seeing God's long vision and long game should bring comfort and to us and appreciating the beauty of his plan. Okay, so Before we wrap up here, I have a couple minutes left to hit this idea of the Lion of Judah. I think this is a really impactful passage as well. This is in Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12. This is as Jacob is dying, he's going to bless all of the 12 sons or tribes with a blessing. And when he comes to Judah, he explicitly points towards this preview of a royal messianic figure. If you look at that passage there in Genesis 49, you'll see royal imagery that's used in the passage. You see Jacob talking about a lion. You see a scepter for authority, and then talk about obedience, a ruler or king that's mentioned in that message. And explicitly in Genesis 49 and verse 10 there, we see this idea of a scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. The key takeaway from this passage being that 49:10 really bridges this covenantal promise and foreshadows the universal reign of Christ. And so this is the front cover of the Bible, and then as Ryan said, if we go to the back cover of the Bible, there in Revelations 5, we have this beautiful imagery of John seeing into a glimpse of what heaven's going to look like, and he's beside himself, he's distraught, he's crying. There's no one that's worthy to open the scroll and be the one that's needed. And then he's told in Revelations 5:5, one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." So we have this beautiful closing the loop here of the Lion of Judah that's rolled out there in Genesis, and then finished here in Revelation, where the writer is telling him this Lion of Judah is our Jesus, our King, and he is worthy of this role. So just to wrap up here, we've got the first gospel there in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, with the seed of the woman crushing the serpent's head. Genesis 12, that Abrahamic covenant is initially rolled out very shortly, very succinctly. Genesis 16, God had that more detailed oath with Abraham, and then in Genesis 22, the oath-bound promise of the offspring will possess the gates of the enemies, and this global blessing of Jesus. And then in Genesis 49, the Lion of Judah is introduced. Didn't talk about it this morning, but we also have a lot of messianic undertones to Joseph's life. Joseph was beloved by the father. Joseph was betrayed by men and his brothers, betrayed by those in Egypt as well, thrown into prison. He's exalted up to a position of power. And then during his time, he saved the known world during the famine with his planning. And we see mentions in the New Testament of Joseph being a messianic type. And so I think the conclusion that we see from Genesis is that it's the seedbed of the gospel that introduces the promise, the seed, the blessing, and then the Lion of Judah, that kingly line that then points to Christ. And so if we think about that in terms of the New Testament authors interpret those Old Testament writings as testifying about Jesus. We see that in Luke and John. In Luke 24, there Jesus explicitly explains on the road to Emmaus to those other disciples that he's with, that those Old Testament writings were about him. And then their eyes are open and their minds are opened in 24:15, and they understand that those Abrahamic covenants, they point to Jesus. So thank you for your time and comments and attention this morning. Look forward to this lesson and these upcoming studies the rest of the summer. Thanks.
Son of my soul, thou sayest,